All right, welcome everyone. I'm going to go ahead and call the Tuesday, September 25th, 2023 Tumwater City Council work session to order. Welcome everyone. I believe that we have everyone here. I'm just double checking. Lietta is actually excused this evening, so I'm doing a quick check here. I think we're still missing Joan. Lietta's excused, and I believe Joan will be joining us. So with that, we will go ahead and start. Is there anything before I have the first item? Oh, there is Joan. Welcome, Joan.
Hi.
So we will start off with the Deschutes River Flood Redirection Study Report, and Dan Smith will be presenting that. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you, Mayor, council members. Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here with you this evening. This presentation culminates about a little over a year's worth of work conducted by the city, which it was really in response to years of questioning from folks in the community, development interests, and other folks concerned with what's happening down in the Deschutes River Valley, primarily between Henderson Boulevard and Brewery Park at Tumwater Falls there. Just about last year, we received a one-time grant from the Department of Ecology for $250,000, to help us study and complete a hydrologic model of the Deschutes River and the flooding that takes place, as you know, fairly frequently in that stretch along the golf course and the former brewery properties. So over the years, the city's been asked questions such as, what causes the flooding down there? What can be done? How much, how much do mitigation options cost? What does permitting look like? Things like that. And, we really didn't have, good examples of qualified responses. This study helped us get there. And so now we can actually provide folks with some concrete information around, what causes the flooding, what are some of the constraining issues, what does permitting look like, and what, if there was interest, what mitigation options, might be explored, and how much those might cost. I'm not going to give the ending away. Meredith Greer with Greer Environmental Consulting, who helped manage the project, is here with us, and she's going to walk you all through the study that we worked with Stantec Engineering, one of the national leaders in this kind of work and understanding surface water systems. This is also in support of one of Council's strategic goals to pursue targeted development opportunities, especially around the brewery properties as well. So we're really excited to kind of present the findings. This was, as I mentioned, over a year's worth of work. Meredith helped lead the environmental teams and convene stakeholders. So we got some pretty broad input from local folks, agencies, the tribes, things like that. So, really kind of spanned the gamut. So with that, I'll turn it over to Meredith, and we'll be certainly available to answer any questions that might come up for you.
Perfect. Thank you, Dan, for that introduction. Good evening, everybody. I'm used to presenting at Public Works Committee, so having to switch up the time a little bit here. I am going to share my screen. And like Dan mentioned, I'm going to kind of give a really broad overview of the Deschutes River Flood Reduction Study Report. I will warn everybody, there are a lot of different images and graphics. Please, if you have any questions at any time, feel free to jump in, raise your hand. I'm happy to answer questions as we go along. It's a little bit of a long presentation, so please let me know if there's anything you've got questions about. As Dan mentioned, a lot of this work stems from questions about the former Olympia Brewery site. What is going on at the site? What could possibly be done from a redevelopment standpoint, how does that work with the fact that we have that river right there? The Deschutes River runs right through the middle of Tumwater. And as everybody here knows, it floods. How does all of that impact the site and what the site could become moving forward? So like Dan had mentioned, the city of Tumwater received a one-time grant from the Department of Ecology for $250,000 that spanned the last financial year. So this work all took place from July 1st of 2022 until June 30th of this year. And really, we were looking at a project site to better understand flooding within the Deschutes Valley that spanned from upstream of Henderson Boulevard all the way until down below, just below the falls at Brewery Park at Tumwater Falls. We're really looking at answering kind of two major questions. The first was getting a better understanding of what do existing flood and erosion risks look like within this area. And the second being, okay, now that we know what flooding looks like, what kind of mitigation could take place that would help reduce the amount of flooding we're seeing on site? Associated with some of those alternatives included high-level costs, as well as identifying permitting needs for those things. The project team, as Dan had kind of mentioned, was led by Stantec Consulting. They're an awesome team that is a leader in this industry. The three folks listed here were instrumental in getting this project done. It's one of few projects that is using this type of data and modeling efforts. So it's really groundbreaking stuff that we were able to do. In addition to that, as Dan mentioned, there were city staff who were involved with this, Dan himself, including Grant Gilmore from the Water Resources and Sustainability Department, and Stan Osborne from Parks and Facilities. In addition, we were able to bring in a couple of outside stakeholders to make sure that this site, which is so public and has so many interests from a variety of groups, is really getting a lot of feedback and input from everybody who should be involved in the site as we went through this. So Alex Rosen from the Department of Ecology was on the team, Erica Marbett from the Squaxin Island Tribe, and then Kyle Kronk from the South Sound YMCA all participated in this project from the very beginning until the very end. Now, like I had mentioned previously, that first step we were really looking at was identifying the existing flood and erosion risks. Ultimately, Stantec created a 2D model of the flooding. We really wanted to figure out, what does flooding look like right now in that site? Can we predict what flooding is going to look like under a variety of storm events? This all comes down to inputting a lot of data into different models. So much so that it crashed my computer a few times trying to download everything. It crashed some of Stantec's computers trying to run everything. But ultimately, we were able to create a really amazing model. A lot of things went into it, including aerial imagery that the Parks Department was able to provide. And ultimately, that was one of the coolest aspects, being able to match up and really make sure that the model was accurate. So some of you might remember from January of 2022, the city had another big storm event and the golf course in that whole area completely flooded. The Parks Department was awesome. They took a drone out there during the flooding and actually were able to fly it up and down. So we have a ton of great aerial images that were really able to match up to the model that Stantec was creating. And one of the coolest things, and one of the ways that we're able to have a lot of confidence in the model and the findings from this study, is that we're able to match up exactly locations that we're seeing in the model with the photos to the exact time they were taken. So we're able to see certain things like trees sticking out of the water in the photos, and then in the model, they're doing the same thing. This photo has probably my favorite part. That bottom left-hand arrow is in red, and it's showing where you can clearly see a sand trap on the golf course is sticking out of the water. We're seeing that same exact thing in the model that Stantec was able to create. So it was really exciting to be able to have all of that information, to have a really good start and confidence in the fact that we're creating a model that is accurately depicting what flooding looks like and how it's impacting the golf course and the brewery site down there. I have a video that I will share super quick. Is anybody able to see the video player now instead of the PowerPoint? Okay, I'm getting nods, awesome. So this is ultimately a really short video that shows what the model looks like in action from Stantec. We're able to see that the different colors of blue are indicating the amount of water on these sites. So the darker the blue, the deeper the depth. That makes sense as we're looking at kind of where the Deschutes River is flowing. That's where a lot of the water normally goes, so it's deeper. What's also cool, and the reason that 2D modeling is really exciting, is we're able to see all of those lines, which actually indicate how quick water is moving. So we've got really long lines within the Deschutes River, But then if you look up here in kind of the right-hand corner behind the brewery, we've got a lot shorter lines. This is showing us that while water is getting in behind that site over there, it's not moving really quickly. It's getting back there and it's kind of staying and sitting during these flood events. So Stantec was able to use all of this, run their model on everything that I'll go over for the rest of the presentation, and to really get a really comprehensive look and understanding at what flooding is doing in this area. We'll stop that. We'll hop back into the presentation here. Just confirming that we're back on the presentation. Awesome, perfect. So ultimately, we were able to come up with a series of maps showing what this area looks like under various storm events. Now, because scientists like being a little bit confusing, you'll notice a lot of words throughout this presentation related to a number and then a year event. Like this one, we're looking at a 2-year event. This really means that instead of this happening every 2 years, we think that a 2-year event has a 50% chance of happening every single year. We'll go through some of the other events like a 25-year and a 100-year event. It's not that we're expecting that to happen once every 100 years, it's that we expect a 1% chance of that size event. Ultimately, the larger the year, the bigger storm events. We're anticipating them to happen a little less frequently. A 2-year event, we'd expect to happen about 50% of the time. So every year has about a 50% chance of happening. When we're looking at that and what a 2-year event looks like right now for the golf course and the brewery property, we're seeing that things for the most part look a little bit okay. Now, I think Chuck would disagree with me. We do definitely have water on the golf course, which is impacting the ability to play, but we don't have a ton of water. We've got a scale here that's showing that the feet of depth of that water. So we've got a couple of feet of water in different places, but it's not having a huge impact. If we move on to a 10-year event, things get a little bit different. So the 2022 event that we were able to take that drone footage of from January of last year is actually almost a perfect match to a 10-year event. So this is what things looked like out there. We're seeing a lot more water on the golf course. We're seeing a lot of water behind the brewery property, although not very deep. As we increase the size of the event, we're going to have more water in the river, and the river is a little bit confined, so it's trying to go other places. So we're seeing a lot more water on the golf course, a lot more water behind the brewery as well. And we get to a 100-year event, that event that has a 1% chance of happening every single year. We have a lot of water pretty much everywhere. This makes a little bit of sense when we're thinking about what rivers look like in their natural state. They usually have a thing called a floodplain, and Tumwater, the Deschutes River, is no different. We call it the Tumwater Valley because we do have that elevation drop where all the water is in a normal, kind of pre-development era. The water was able to spread out when it flooded and move around a little bit more. Now that we've got things in that area that are considered more of the built environment, like the golf course and roads and things like that, it's restricting the river a little bit. So now we're trying to balance what the natural environment needs along with what the built environment needs in situations like this. And the bigger the storm events, the harder that gets. Which kind of brings us to the second step of this whole process. So we figured out what the flooding looks like now under various conditions. And as we saw, there's a lot of water on the golf course. There's a lot of water behind the brewery. So we asked the question of, okay, if we wanted to try and reduce the amount of water back there, what could we do? Ultimately, with the stakeholder group that you had seen earlier, we were able to brainstorm a lot of different alternatives. Stantec reviewed 17 different alternatives, running each one of them through the model, the little video that I showed you earlier, to determine, if we did this, is that actually effective? Some of the things that we looked at that turned out to be not super effective included things like lowering the height of the dam at Tumwater Falls. Other things like that, which, they were awesome to look at, but didn't actually turn out when we looked at the model to really help reduce flooding on that site. So ultimately, there were 6 alternatives that did show some promise for significantly reducing flooding. And those are kind of the 6 that I'll go over today. The rest of the alternatives are all kind of covered in the report that I think Dan has attached to his staff report, although I think it's nearly 250 pages, so I understand if you don't dive all the way into it. Ultimately, what I tried to do was put together a list of every single alternative with some information, including kind of what it's called in the report. Like I had mentioned, there were 17 that were looked at. And so all of the the names for the alternatives we're looking at come from the report. So they're not going to go 1 through 6 here because 1 through 6 weren't the ones that were most effective. So we're bouncing around a little bit, but I'm hoping to keep everything standard because some of the figures I'll show you have the same names. So the first alternative that did show some promise was a large flood channel. Now in the report and in modeling, it looks like what we're seeing left, kind of just like a blue, kind of a snake almost, that seems pretty darn straight. When we're thinking about what this would actually look like if it were to be constructed, it'd look a little bit more like it does on the right. We have the main river channel, and then we have an option for water when it gets really high to go off to that right and to really spread out the flow and engage some of that floodplain. Ultimately, each one of these alternatives also has a really high level of costs associated with it. So up in the right-hand corner, you'll see that this kind of alternative is budgeted about $1.8 million to construct. As we'll go through this, we'll kind of step up alternatives in terms of their effectiveness. This one being effective, but the last one we'll look at being the most effective at reducing flooding. And this also will see an increase in the amount of cost. So the low end here is about $2 million for a mitigation alternative that does have some impact. And when we look at that, we really do start to see some impacts, especially at those lower storm events. So this year is a 10-year event that we're looking at in this one. So again, that's kind of what that 2022 January event looked like. And we saw from the drone footage that there was water behind the brewery. If we were to implement this kind of mitigation alternative, we're getting almost no water, no standing water on that brewery property, which is exciting if you're a developer thinking about being able to redevelop it. A trend we will see, however, as we kind of move through these, is that a lot of these options are good at smaller events, but once we get to larger and larger events, they kind of end up getting washed out just by the amount of water coming through the Deschutes River. For a 25-year event, on the left, we've kind of got the existing conditions. If we had done nothing, this is where the water would be. And on the right, we're seeing the benefit of this alternative. Now we are seeing, there is a pretty big reduction in the amount of water. The brewery building itself that's there on the left-hand photo is almost half covered with water. On the right, we don't seem to have a lot of flooding within the building itself. When we're looking at the 100-year event, though, we're seeing almost no impact from this mitigation. Something to keep in mind when we're looking at 100 years out is we're also factoring into that climate change. So for this region, it's forecasted that for the Tumwater area and Western Washington in general, we're expecting to receive under climate change conditions a lot more precipitation, so a lot more rain events and bigger events. So when they do come, they'll drop a lot more water. So when we're thinking about that and we're trying to plan out for years like 2080, that is also really impacting what these areas look like, and something that we wanted to make sure to take a look at in the study. We want to make sure that everybody's having the most accurate information if they're making decisions about what to do with the property, knowing that the amount of water we're going to be seeing in the river is going to be increasing over the next couple of decades. So that was the first alternative. The second alternative was looking at what Stantec is calling benching. Ultimately, the goal of this alternative is to really take the area that they've outlined in orange and reduce the elevation. When they did their modeling, they reduced that elevation by about 4 feet. Ultimately, that would look a little bit more like constructing a wetland or opening up the floodplain to allow the river to reconnect. So the photo on the right shows that we've got a river on the right-hand side of the photo, but then inside we do have some area that just is holding water naturally, has a lot more trees. Constructed wetlands are a really popular kind of alternative and mitigation option being used throughout Western Washington. So when Stantec is referring to benching, I find it helpful to think about the image on the right to see what this would actually look like in practice. Got a cost up in the upper right-hand corner as well. Again, we're increasing the cost a little bit more with each one of the alternatives we look at, but ideally that's seeing a little bit more impact and benefit to the flooding. Similar situation that we'll see throughout all of the alternatives. At a 10-year event, pretty much every single one of the alternatives is doing a really good job of keeping the brewery site dry. Different story as we're getting to 25-year events. This one is a little bit better than the 25-year event just from the stream channel alone. But the 100-year event, we're not seeing that much of a benefit. The next option, and kind of the last of three different components we'll see as we put them together for different alternatives, is removing a substation. So Puget Sound Energy has a substation down in the area shown in red on the photo on the left. This substation is currently creating what we like to refer to kind of as a pinch point. So all the water is being forced to go through this narrower opening in order to get to Tumwater Falls. So if we're able to remove that pinch, to remove that narrowed area and let the water kind of back up a little bit more, then we're able to actually increase the amount of water going down to Tumwater Falls, since we're opening up the narrowest point right now of the river. So the substation related costs are a little bit, there's a broader variety in what the cost could be, as you'll see reflected in almost a $3 million difference for this one. A lot of that is related to whether kind of the status of the substation. So if the substation just needs to be kind of decommissioned and removed, that's the lower end cost. That means the project will cost about $3 million to construct. If Puget Sound Energy still need to use that substation and the substation needs to then be relocated and up and functioning somewhere else, then that's where we get that higher end cost of about a $6 million project for this option. Again, similar themes for the 10-year event, we're seeing a lot of benefit in flood reduction. 25-year event, we're at least keeping all of the water off of the building right now. In the 100-year event, we're starting to see a little bit of progress. So the photo on the left is showing that a lot of the water on site is in that yellow category, that 2 to 3 feet. On the right-hand side, we're seeing that we're able to reduce the depth of that water. A lot more of it is green, we're in that 1 to 2 foot range, but there still is quite a lot of water on the site. Now we're getting into the last couple of alternatives, and these are generally combinations of kind of the three options we've seen before. The flood channel, the benching, and then the substation removal in a couple of different combinations. Again, similar themes for the 10-year event, as well as for the 25-year event. In the 100-year event, we're getting a little bit better. We're seeing that the building isn't quite as covered by water. That upper part that we're seeing kind of ringed in blue is getting a little bit bigger each time. Alternative 10A is looking at, instead of a small floodplain, or instead of a small flood channel, which is about 25 feet long, if you doubled it and made it a 50-foot wide channel, what kind of benefits could you see there? So this is the kind of wetland benching, floodplain reconnection option, along with more of a dedicated channel to help provide passage for that water. Seeing really great results in terms of keeping water off of the site at the 10-year event. At the 25-year event, it's getting pretty good. 100-year event, though, we're still getting a lot of overtopping from the site. And then the last option we're looking at is pretty much, if we could have the best of everything, if we could have the biggest channel we could get, bench it the most we could, and move that substation, what kind of benefit will we get? And this is the one that has the highest price point. If we've done everything, if the substation does end up needing to be rebuilt somewhere else, this project is going to run about $7.1 million. And again, at that 10-year event level, we're seeing awesome results. At that 25-year event level, we're even seeing the best results we've seen so far. Instead of having some of the water up to the northeastern part of the building, we're just seeing a couple scattered areas that seem to be being filled in with water. But once again, when we get to that 100-year event, we've still got a ton of water on the site. So ultimately, the goal of this project was to look at a bunch of different mitigation options to see what options were. We've left it kind of broad in terms of, here are some options, here's what they look like, here are costs and permits associated with them. And the next steps are kind of broad and open. So the project ultimately, from the Department of Ecology standpoint, and the funding that Tumwater had to do the project, ended on June 30th of this year. The project was anticipated to cost about $300,000. Like I mentioned earlier, Tumwater had a $250,000 grant So the stormwater utility was kicking in that other $50,000. We were able to close the project below budget by about $30,000, which is always a nice sign. And now the project has completed the goals that were set out. And now is an opportunity for either using the document as it is right now. It is definitely a usable document for whether it's for internal City of Tumwater staff for making development decisions, or to hand to developers or other folks who have questions about the site. Now there is something that we're able to reference to. There's also a number of other steps that could be taken. I think Stantec has outlined about 10 different next steps that could be taken within the document. I've pulled a couple of them out here as options for the site. You could decide if there was a proposed redevelopment approach where we had more of a site plan, had some information about potential areas that could receive more water if it was multi-use. You can flood the X area, but we want this other area kept dry. You could model what that would look like under these different mitigation scenarios and really try and work out how to keep the areas that need to be dry. You could also look at assessing other flood mitigation alternatives. While we had gone through and reviewed 17 others, I'm sure there are a whole host of others that could be looked at if there were some other stakeholders brought to the table, or if there were some different kind of perspectives taken in terms of looking at what might work for the area. In addition, we had kind of seen that there are 6 alternatives that would provide some of that flood benefit. The City of Tumwater could decide that it makes sense to take one of those alternatives a little bit further and put out a conceptual design. That would give everybody a little bit better idea of what the alternative would look like, how the river would be set out, potential other co-benefits that might occur from not just helping to reduce flooding, but they could include things like providing habitat for salmonids. They could be things like including walking trails for folks if there's an option that includes something like a wetland. Another kind of option is that, and one that the City of Tumwater is very aware of, is doing some sort of cleanup on the site in preparation for kind of whatever the next steps are. The City of Tumwater had received a grant from the EPA that I think Austin Ramirez is taking the lead on to look at cleaning up and trying to really establish what sort of legacy contaminants exist on site. So there could be an effort to really try and clean that site up for whatever the next step is. Another option is to apply for more funding from a grant agency to either look at designing a project or implementing one of the options. Dan will probably take over from here and kind of provide any more wrap up, but I'm happy to take any questions about kind of what we have done for this project. And I think Dan can answer any other questions about steps moving forward or things along those lines.
Great. Thanks, Meredith. And just kind of summation, the model that Stantec had provided us, was well done. It was calibrated to existing conditions. Thankfully, depending on your perspective, we had the 2022 flood event that, really gave us some real time, data to work with. So from that perspective, good information to work from, and, then build some, conceptual alternatives around mitigation. The end result really kind of being, no matter, the mitigation, the 17 options that we looked at, not one of the solutions, per se solved the problem. There will be flooding, in the Deschutes Valley, and it will cost money to mitigate. So, whether it's, a public agency, a private developer, or, whoever, there is going to be costs, associated with mitigation before, anything, in addition can be done as well. And so that has to be kind of factored into whoever's calculus around, what level of risk, anyone, willing to, work in the Deschutes Valley, can take on. And, thankfully, we now have some of that information we can provide to the public, that they can start to make those kind of value judgments and decisions from. So, good work by, Meredith. Appreciate everything that she has done in Stantec and the review team that we had out there. In addition, we also had a number of folks throughout City Hall staff, checking in, various parts of the way and kind of reviewing the work that's being done and providing some comment in there too. So for this project in particular, the work is complete. It doesn't mean we've solved, or we have answers to all of the questions. And so, there may still be some questions out there that we could, continue to look at, or, and depending on, the nature of those questions, find additional grants to do some more work or whatever. So I guess I open it up to any questions y'all might have, or any thoughts or other comments.
Councilmember Althauser.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks for this presentation. This is super, just from an intellectual level, like really fascinating and interesting too. I guess I'm just sort of broadly curious about if like the flooding challenges are a relatively new phenomenon. Like this was an industrial area that was producing, there's the kegging facility and the bottling plant stuff. Like, did they just deal with it? It's like, it's flooded, you're not coming into work today. Or like, is this relatively onset and getting worse and worse due to effects from climate and glaciers melting more in the summertime, higher flow or something? That I don't know enough to know whether that's a rational conclusion to draw, but how did they used to deal with this? They just deal and just closed down for business for a few days till flooding went away, and then cleaned it up with a mop if it got inside. Like,
pretty much, there are floor drains in all of those warehouse buildings, things like that. And, it was a industry that could, take that kind of flooding, intermittently, as, Meredith was alluding to, with climate change, we're modeling in there, we're seeing some changing, climatic, events, we anticipate that's going to change even greater into the future. But yeah, I mean, the brewery had a business practice that, allowed them to be able to, kind of withstand, those impacts, periodically. And so, we don't see flooding like we saw in 2022, every year.
Yeah.
So those were intermittent. And the Deschutes is a very flashy river. It comes up quick and it'll drop quick. So, maybe a day or two at the most, we'll generally see an impact out there. So, yeah, they've been able just to withstand it through that.
Okay. Thank you.
Councilmember Cathey.
Thank you. Thanks to both of you for all of this. This has certainly occupied a lot of time over the last year or so. So it's very interesting. And to answer part of Michael's questions, that's why people would look down there and see little rowboats tied outside those buildings, and they would ask what it was. And
in some of the well houses down there, you can actually go in and you'll see kind of markings on the doors as to where the various flood levels have hit over the years. And when we're working with various agencies, you're setting your pump, and your electrical equipment above those levels, to make sure that at least you'll get most of them that are below that.
No, I remember when I moved here, everybody talked about the 100-year flood, whatever, that was really bad down there. I have a question about, did you have on this, within this group, environmentalists and so forth, that what would be the impact and hopefully a really positive way if the part of that down there was a wetland, estuary, that type of thing, because you're creating all new possibilities for wildlife and for different growths of different kinds of flora and fauna. So I'm just wondering what that.
So the Squaxin tribe kind of filled that kind of gap for us, from an environmental perspective, and co-managers in the watershed. And so, their interests are definitely more towards reversion and habitat restoration, towards anything else. And of course, fisheries management and things like that too. So yeah, they kind of filled that gap for us. Given the time frame of the project, it was kind of a very quick turnaround. It wasn't intended to have a large, like public stakeholder engagement process, but we wanted to make sure that we were on some level, we brought in the technical expertise that could speak to those various components, whether it was, economic development or it was, environmental restoration, just for the perspectives. And then working with Stantec, who's a pretty broad firm, in and of themselves, to kind of like look at, this project from various angles to say, okay, what can be done down there. But eventually, ultimately, really, it wasn't about finding a solution of what could be done down there. Just if we're to mitigate flooding, what would that look like? And what are some of those general costs at a high level? Now, if there were to be to take it to the next level, to identify a solution, so to speak, that would be a much broader stakeholder engagement process if we were to go through that. This was really just looking at the environmental conditions, the flooding conditions, and if, kind of broad stroke response, what could be done to reduce those impacts.
So you would pass this information on or have conversations with potential people who looked at the property for a variety of different, these
Right.
would be suggested, or these would be things that you've looked into, and so they'd take it from there if they were.
Yeah, correct. So private development, public work, anybody who's interested in additional data to understand kind of how the flooding that, does historically happen and will continue to happen into the future. What does those conditions look like, so that the raw data that we have that goes into the model, that's going to be really, is super important for anybody that's going to be moving forward with any type of projects, again, whether it's public or private.
Now, does this mean that this isn't just for the valley part? So I don't know. We haven't had a report on it for a long time, but could somebody develop the knoll and not the valley, or vice versa? Because this impacts just the valley, right? This doesn't impact what falls in the.
Correct. Yeah, we basically stopped at the falls because those are the constraining points for the floodwaters. That's where it's basically going to start backing up. And as Meredith showed in one of the earlier slides, it was a pretty wide, kind of scope area that was modeled. But you're not going to see those same level of impacts over by Henderson Boulevard or farther back. You will see some of that there, but again, if you mitigate the downstream constraining points, those other places will lessen as well. And so the area of focus was really kind of the former brewery properties, right there, just adjacent to the golf course.
And one last question, where is the railroad in any of this, or is it always going to be there, constraining some of the things that?
Yeah, we didn't conceive any alternatives that removed the railroad or anything along those lines. That's just considered to be part of the landscape, through this study area.
I thought maybe they might pitch in to find out about the flooding, but good job. Thanks. It's very, very, like Michael says, it's both intellectual and environmental and, economic. Great job.
I'll go to Councilmember Swarthout and then Councilmember Jefferson.
I hope I didn't miss this at the beginning of the presentation, but had the river ever been manipulated at that point? Like from Pioneer Park, when the brewery owned it, did they make changes to that affected the path of the river? Has it always been there, or that? I was just curious about that.
I think Chuck Denny, Parks Director, has a really neat video of kind of the making of Pioneer Park, or the golf course down there, where the former brewery, the Olympia Brewery, actually kind of armored a lot of the banks through there and created that river channel as it sits today. And Meredith might actually have an image of it. But the former brewery who built the golf course did a lot of work to kind of create the river channel as it exists today, to try and keep it in that channel. And as Meredith indicated, rivers like to move. They like to, the entire Deschutes River Valley was created by the Deschutes River, over the millennia of years, kind of just meandering back and forth between the two kind of slopes on either side. What we see is just a moment in time. I mean, just even at Pioneer Park, where we're working on some restoration work, I think this is what the last almost looks like, 20 years, about that Meredith is showing. You can see how that river is trying to move, and that's through an area, with large trees. Rivers like to move. The golf course did some work to try and keep it in place.
I think, I remember, because we've been through that, and to see that one thing you put up again is just profound to think about. When you first moved here in 1990, and then just see how far the river has moved towards the park is just amazing. So, and the other part of it too is that I saw part of the report that you sent us. It has to do. They had a thing in there too that talked about the East Street extension, so we didn't need to worry about that because that was part of the report as well. And they also talked about when we're looking at our comp plan. So that part was in there. Is that anything that we need to discussed, or is it we'll be discussing that when we work on our comp plan?
Yeah, so those are elements that we just want to make sure that we are capturing, as we move forward with, the comp planning process or the East Street Extension project. We're incorporating this information that was in here. Again, didn't necessarily try to provide all of the information that would be needed, for either of those projects. Just kind of some preliminary information to say, here's what to expect, or recommendations as further study kind of thing.
Yeah, because I echo what my the other council members said too. It's amazing, so much work that went into this and how much information it's provided. So thank you for all the work on that.
Right. Councilmember Jefferson, then Councilmember Gabi.
Yes, Dan. I think course of action 3 or option 3 and 5 discuss removing the substation. So, how long has the substation been there, and how does flooding affect the substation's use?
I don't have any information from PSE or the brewery that that flooding would normally affect its overall use. But really it is a constraining element on the river, which kind of surprised us. We thought maybe the dam at the Brewery Falls was kind of one of the more larger constraints, but the geography and the modeling show that as the floodwaters start to kind of back up against that substation, that's really one of the constraining factors, which is why they looked at what does it take to move that, so you can kind of open up that floodplain so the waters could move more freely. So the substation, from as I understand it, has a greater effect on the flooding than the flooding has on the substation.
Okay, thanks, Dan.
Councilmember Gabi.
Hi, Dan. I am flipping through this report here. I briefly saw where the bridge on Anderson across the Deschutes River was briefly mentioned, but it didn't really say much. Maybe I'm missing it. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is that last year, the flooding in that area started from the farm to the right of me that way, and it went all the way to the entrance to Pioneer Park, and it goes a little ways to the parking lot. So now, I haven't seen that or described that. Is there any study that is done for the structure of that bridge? One, and is there any study done for the soil around the park before you get to the golf course itself, the football field area?
So you're talking about the Henderson Boulevard Bridge and as a kind of an impediment to the floodwaters. I don't know if Meredith has a image of maybe kind of the floodwaters as it kind of moves around there, but as I understood it, that really wasn't much of a constraint, because the water is moving around in so many other different ways and then spreading out on both sides. And again, we've seen flooding through this system, for many years. I don't, and I would probably have to, ask, Brandon if there's any, kind of overall concerns with undermining of that bridge, but there wasn't anything brought forth through this study that really kind of evaluated, what that bridge does, or if there is any constraints. Meredith, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah. 1 second. To the as you go into the park, to the west of the park, the topography is a little higher. So that means that water is not going to go that way. The water will actually go towards the slope, which is the gradient, which is more towards, I think, on the north side, or maybe the east side, for lack of geography. So the floods tend to stay around at least for about a week or two. Now it's been raining for the past 4 days. I haven't driven past that road in the last 2 days, but I bet if you drove past it now, even though the golf course area does not have flooding or standing water, around that particular area that I mentioned will have standing water, and it does every year. Thank you.
Yeah, we definitely see standing water, on both sides, of Henderson, particularly because you do also have a constraint to the north with the railroad tracks, and there is flooding upstream of Henderson, where it will jump its banks and, kind of follow those low flow lines. predominantly to the north. And then again, it's Henderson kind of constrains that. Sometimes it goes over the railroad tracks there and into the properties north of Pioneer Park as well.
Yes, we looked at the entire study area, including above Henderson Boulevard, and we are aware, I know that one of the other projects that I'm helping the Water Resources Department on is at Pioneer Park and the amount of erosion going on in that site. Some of this is a kind of a balancing act of areas that it makes sense to let flood and to allow to have a little bit more water on them. The golf course in particular is an area where being able to keep the course open and reduce the number of days where it's just down and cannot be played is a priority for the city. And so being able to have Pioneer Park flood a little bit longer and have some of the water stay there is kind of one of the balancing acts that the city has been playing and working with the Parks Department to work on. One of the reasons that we were focusing so much on the area near the brewery is that a lot of the water is being kind of built up even past Henderson Boulevard because of that really narrow pinch point going down toward the falls. And so that's almost acting as the drain in a bathtub. So we've got all of this water that's keep backing up above Henderson Boulevard. And if we're able to kind of work on reducing the pinch points in the areas that we're really trying to funnel all of that water through, we'll likely see a lot of benefits upstream as well. Some of them are scales of magnitude just because of the amount of water there, but that's kind of the area where we were seeing the biggest impacts from narrowing the area and having a lot of water flood. And so starting there and then working our way back will help to improve flooding kind of throughout that whole area.
All right, thank you.
Councilmember Sortha.
I think you answered my question because I was looking at the last photo you showed, and the gray piece would be where the bridges, the bridges. It looked like, to the east, it was really, really flooded, and it looked like the bridge going underneath the bridge is a pinch point. So that's what you're talking about, that you recognize that it is a pinch point at this point. And
so especially through this area, the water is actually able to back up some. We're definitely dealing with a lot less infrastructure here. We're seeing that on both sides of the bridge, it's backed up, but we don't have roads or houses in there that have been flooded out or anything like that. So while the river does get really wide through this area, it is able to access a lot more of that floodplain, which is why we're seeing so much water everywhere else. So it's probably a pinch point for some of the upstream water, but it's definitely not one of the reasons or not the main cause of a lot of the flooding that we're seeing downstream at the brewery property and at the golf course.
okay.
Any other questions? So this is very useful information, and especially as we get the grant, working on the EPA grant for all of the other. This is just better and more information to see what is the best choices moving forward. So I really appreciate this report and the information. And we are having bigger floods more often, so.
Great.
Anything
Well,
else?
So if anything comes up, feel free to reach out to me, and other questions come up, and we'll get you an answer, and we'll keep you informed as if we're moving forward on any other kind of projects to look at this in the area. But thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Meredith. So with that, we move to the Mayor's City Administrator report, and I will start with Lisa. Do you have anything?
Thank you, Mayor. Just a couple of quick things for council members and anybody who's attending in the audience. So as a reminder, this weekend, this Saturday from 10 to 4 is the Tumwater Falls Fest down at Tumwater Falls Park. So that is, I think we're in the second year of that event. Celebrating water as a place of healing and community, since it seems like an appropriate time to mention that following this presentation. And there are all sorts of activities, and there will be artists and makers and food vendors. And so we hope people will choose to join us. I understand that Mr. Denny has ordered some nice sunny weather for that event. So we will see how well he is able to fulfill that particular request. Another announcement, the Community Human Services Program that the city sponsors Applications are due by noon tomorrow. We've sent out a couple of different emails to the local organizations that have typically applied for that funding source. As a reminder for those in the audience, this is about $15,000 that is distributed to local organizations in the Tumwater area that provide necessary aid to Tumwater residents who may be in a vulnerable position or a low income or disadvantaged position and need a little bit of help. And then lastly, you may recall a couple weeks ago, Alyssa mentioned that October 2 through 8 is National Work Without Driving Challenge. The point of this challenge is a national initiative to help raise the awareness and understanding of elected officials and policymakers around what the barriers are in communities for non-driving residents. And so if you are interested at all in participating or learning more about that, I would invite you to email and connect with Alyssa. She would be more than happy to answer any questions or give you more information if you would like to participate. And I believe that's all for now, Mary. Thank you.
Great. Actually, you had covered all of the things that the one thing, especially the Fall Fest this weekend. And it does look like, at least for the moment, it changes quickly, that there will actually be decent weather that day, which will be great. And I can't believe we're already talking about October. So this year is zooming by. So with that, we will see everyone. Oh, Councilmember Swarthout, did you have a question?
I just wanted to say I went to the library today, and I just wanted to let the audience know and our council members that there's an art display there where local artists are just have paintings, and it's all around the brewery. It has to do with brewery and the local area, and they're really extraordinary. So I saw those today, and I just wanted to share that if anybody wants to zoom in and go see them, they really are pretty. So nice job.
Oh, great. Thank you for letting us know. I might go over there tomorrow and see. So, so with that, we are covered all of our business. So with that, I will adjourn our meeting for this evening, and thank you and have a great evening.